Hey everybody, welcome to the webinar. Just want to make sure everything is working correctly. It looks like the live stream has started. So thank you all for joining us. And welcome. I'm curious to know where you're joining us from. I'm in the Miami area, but we get people attending from pretty much all over the place. So let me know in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it over on the side over here. So if you have questions, feel free to bring them up. I'll try to get to questions as they come through. Can't promise I can get to all of them. I'll try my best, but we're going to be talking about comprehension strategies today. And I think you'll find this very, very helpful if you're doing a lot of reading or if you feel like you struggle with comprehension, and that could be for a variety of reasons. We're going to be covering that today. So I see Tom's joining us from the Detroit area. I see Benjamin, he's going to be coming to one of our classes, I think, in New York. Hey, Ben, nice to see you. Arizona. I used to live in the Chicago area. That's my hometown. So welcome, everyone. Regardless of where you're joining us from around the world, I think you are going to find today's session very helpful. I see Maggie from Jersey City. Yeah, feel free to use that. West Texas. Awesome. Hello, Teddy. We're going to be going through a number of things today. And when we cover different courses, I would say all these courses fall under the category of productivity, right? We're trying to be more productive. Whether you're a student or a working professional, reading is part of the game, right? Sometimes, obviously, as a student, you're trying to further your career, get through school in your academic career, but in a professional sense, there's still a lot of reading that needs to be done. I mean, if you're someone that just loves to learn, and you have maybe a stack of books that you've been wanting to get through, being able to read more efficiently, that means having a decent speed, that means having pretty good comprehension, and there's also a third area, which is retention. So these are the three areas we're going to focus on. Welcome, everyone. I see South Texas, San Francisco, LA, Detroit, Jacksonville, Dallas, Panama City, Cleveland. Wow, all over the place. So hello from the sunny state of Florida. I'm in the Miami area. Now, I want to draw a distinction here real quick, because comprehension, that is, what are you understanding the moment you're reading something, like in that present time period. That's your comprehension. And then retention is, what do you remember later on? Like if I quiz you on it, or if you got to give a presentation on it. Sometimes your comprehension might be decent, but you might forget things later on. Nobody has a perfect memory. We'll talk a little bit about memory today, but we'll be focusing more so on this side of the equation. Obviously, we want all of these to be as efficient as possible if we're going to be efficient readers. So here's where you could find the materials for today's session. If you go to irisreading.com/comp, and I will put that link in the chat. It's also in the description of the video. If you look right underneath your screen there, there is a link to where you could find that, irisreading.com/comp. Got that in the chat in case you want to go there. That's just going to forward you over to a Dropbox link where you can find all of the materials. Actually, I'll just double check to make sure it's actually working. Hang on one second here. And that'll forward me over. Yep, there's the 3 PDFs. You can download them. Don't start reading them yet, but we're going to be getting to them as we go along today. Also, just a heads up, if you're trying to follow us on some other social network, obviously we're here on YouTube. I've got 2 channels. There's our Iris Reading channel. And if you want to follow me directly, I'm at Paul Nowak. It's pronounced Novak with a W, but it sounds like a V. You can also find us through Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, by the way, just let me know that you attended one of the webinars or seen the videos on YouTube, because I get a lot of people that try to connect with me and then they try to tell me stuff, and I kind of ignore a lot of these solicitation messages because there's just too many of them. But I'm very happy to connect with you if you've taken one of our classes or watched one of our videos here on YouTube. Just let me know when you send the connection message over on LinkedIn or wherever it is. So let's get into it. When we think about the components of comprehension, what exactly are they? Because it's a multifaceted thing. One, it's, well, you've got some information in your head. Can you explain it? What are the different perspectives? So that's another element of comprehension, right? Knowing, there's one point of view and then there's other points of views. There's also your self-knowledge, or you could think of it as background knowledge. What do you already know about a particular topic? And that plays a part in comprehension. If you have some knowledge on this topic, you're going to have a little better comprehension than somebody that's going into it with zero background info. And then there's can you empathize? Can you kind of empathize with the position? Sometimes there's opinion pieces where we got to see, can we understand their point of view? Also, how can this be applied practically. So it's one thing to get the information and read about it. It's another thing to apply it in your work. So, I mean, I grew up, I was in the, well, I studied finance in college, but I worked in the trading world for a number of years. So there's a different element of, learning about finance. I worked in the futures and options trading world, or also in the investment world. And it's one thing to learn about investing. It's another thing to like take losses or to make gains in investing, right? So applying things practically, and then how has this been interpreted by others? There's one other thing, I didn't have it on the slide, but also like looking at things from a critical standpoint of, what's the source? When I'm reading something, like I've got this book here, just started on second thought, Outsmarting Your Mind's Hardwired Habits. Now, one of the things I like to do is always look, well, what's the copyright on this, especially when we're dealing with information that could be dated. So also figuring out what is the source. Now, assessing your comprehension, this is easier said than done. 1 second here. Sorry, I just realized I had my slides paused over here. Let me back up. Back up. Here's where you could find us. Sorry about that. That was just the platform that we're using here. By the way, we're also kind of new to doing these live streams. So if you like what we're doing, let us know and we'll keep doing them. If you don't like what we're doing, well, tell your enemies about it, and then they can go through the torture of watching me drag on and on. Here's where you can find us. Here's where we were talking about the different elements of comprehension, right? There's various components to understanding material. And when it comes to assessing your comprehension, actually, what do you understand? Like putting a percentage on it is not as clear cut as some people think it is. But we have ways of assessing comprehension. Like the most popular way is the standardized reading test, but I want you to know it's not a perfect way to assess comprehension. The reality is comprehension is impossible to measure objectively. So here's what I mean by that. Objectively would be like, I know exactly what percentage is understanding, what your understanding is in the brain, but we get a sense of it from comprehension tests, right? We've all taken them. Actually, maybe we shouldn't call them comprehension tests. So they're more accurately called standardized diagnostic reading tests. And when you take a test like this, we all have, they give you a passage and then they ask you questions. The trouble with this is when they're asking you questions, they're asking you, what do you remember about what you just read? And we already mentioned earlier that what you remember is a little different than what you comprehend. Comprehension is the real-time understanding of the material. That's comprehension, real time. Retention is in the future, later on, like when you're done with the passage, what do you still remember? Now, retention could also be, what do you remember a day from now? We've all had situations where we study all night for a test, and then you get to a question and you're like, oh, I don't know what it is, or I know what it is, I just can't recall the information. Sometimes they call that the tip of the tongue phenomenon. But that's a problem on the retention side of things. You might have had great comprehension, but forgotten everything later on. Now, when it comes to standardized reading tests, they're asking you, what do you remember? And they're also kind of assessing your ability to find the answer, right? Because if you are good at taking tests, you might know strategies for finding the answers quickly. Now, I want you to know that all of this is not necessarily a measure of your comprehension. It's also measuring what is your skill? What are your skills as a test taker? Some people get extremely anxious and stressed out by these tests. Maybe that's you. I know I've felt that stress when I was in high school taking the SAT and the ACT tests. I would get extremely anxious about it. So what if you're able to calm down? That's a different kind of a skill. If you're able to keep yourself calm in situations of stress, well, that's a different kind of a skill, right? So these are things that you just need to be aware of. And one interesting thing, and I love telling this story because we've worked with a lot of high school students, but we also work even more so with college students. And actually, half of our work is with just working professionals. But I remember we did a program at a high school before, and they brought in 3 groups of students. There was a group that was like above average in terms of comprehension, below average, and another group that was in between. So they give us 3 groups. Now, the below average group, I remember asking them, how did you assess their comprehension. And of course, they said a standardized reading test. And I got a chance to look through every student's test to see how they did. And there was this one kid in the class, he scored 19 out of 38. So he got half the questions right. Looks terrible, right? Until you look at the actual test, and he only answered 20 questions, it turns out. So how do you feel about his comprehension now? Now this looks bad, right? 19 out of 38, that is without a doubt a bad score, but you can't say that this kid has poor comprehension because they got 19 out of the 20 questions that they attempted. What happened here is the student ran out of time and didn't bother to guess on the rest of the questions. Now, if he did guess on the last 18 questions, he would have had a better score, but it doesn't mean his comprehension would be better. So again, just some things to be aware of when we're talking about comprehension. Now, I want to start with a little reading exercise, and I'll have it on my screen, but you can find this PDF at irisreading.com/comp. So irisreading.com/COMP, and just download focusrituals.pdf. I'm going to have it on my screen like this. However, for some of you, this might be way too small for you to read it. So if you're looking for that link, it is below the video. And go ahead and download that. Hopefully you have it on your screen. Or if you happen to be viewing this within YouTube, just expand the screen so you can see this text. But for a lot of you, especially if you're joining us on a mobile phone, it might be too small for you to read. That's why I want you to download the material. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with just a couple minutes of reading. And you see I've got 2 minutes at the top here. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read as much of this as you can. And then we're going to kind of assess your comprehension. So it's going to be 2 minutes. You will see the timer ticking away. You see how it's ticking away there? So we'll know once we're done. But just read the way you normally would. Go at whatever speed feels comfortable for you to understand this material. I will stop you after a minute is up. I'm sorry, a minute, after 2 minutes is up. And just read the way you normally would. So in the meantime, I will turn off my webcam during this exercise. So temporarily, this is goodbye. I'll be back in 2 minutes, but you're just going to read this document at whatever speed feels comfortable for the best comprehension you could possibly get, and we'll do 2 minutes of reading. Okay, go ahead and begin reading. Okay, let me stop you there. And that was just a couple minutes of reading. And what I want you to do now is I want you to assess your own comprehension on a 0 to 100% scale. And here's why. Remember we said earlier, standardized reading tests, kind of tough to measure comprehension perfectly or objectively. In this case, I want you to do it very subjectively. So if you felt like this was super easy to read, I understood this very well, you might say 90%, okay? If you felt like your comprehension was pretty good, 80%. If I felt like it was so-so, I might say 70%. And if you felt like, I was reading this and then I got distracted by another YouTube video over on the side there, and all of a sudden I realized, wait, we're reading and I have ADHD, you might say 20%. Or you might be very precise and say 67.3%. Put a number, write it down somewhere. You can put it in the chat if you want. You don't have to share it in the chat. I'll leave that up to you. But I want to start off with a benchmark for yourself. This is like a personal benchmark. Now, why are we doing this? When you're assessing your own comprehension, because measuring it is not really feasible. Like, you read for 2 minutes, we don't have a readily available standardized reading test for the 2 minutes of reading you just did. And even if you were going through, let's say you were going through material in your textbook, if you're a student, you read, for 15 minutes, we don't have a standardized reading test for that 15 minutes of reading. But there are situations where we know our comprehension was good and situations where we know it was terrible, right? Sometimes you ever read a whole page of text and you look up like, I have absolutely no clue what I've been reading this whole time. Yeah, sometimes our mind sometimes we zone out. And if that's the case, we know comprehension is very, very low, like 10, 20, 30%. Okay, and other times we're confident. So think of this as like a confidence measure, okay? And the other reason you're gonna do this, I see some of you putting in the chat 75% or 85 to 90%. If I have you read some new material right now, you could compare it to your number from before. So let's say I gave you a totally different passage, and this is like theoretical physics, and you have no background in that. You read it, you're gonna look at your number from before. If it was 90% last time, and now you read, you might be like, ooh, I got like 50% this time. Or you might feel like, oh, if I gave you a children's book, you'd be like, oh, this is easier. It's a kid's book, 100%. So that's why we're doing this. Think of it sort of like a benchmark. Now, as far as comprehension tips go, let's get into that because there are some simple ways that we can improve comprehension, and we're going to talk about a variety of methods here. So first, a lot of it has to do with improving our focus. We already mentioned how it's so easy to get distracted internally or externally. When I say externally, I mean things like a phone, right? So it should go without saying, and I know this is easier said than done for many of us. If you got to get some really, really focused reading, it's probably a good idea to limit distractions, turn off the phone. Now, limiting distractions is sometimes easier said than done. Maybe you got to keep your phone on for work. Maybe, I don't know, like when I grew up in high school, I've got 5 brothers. So I grew up in a very, very large household. And, as far as space goes, if everybody's crammed into one place and you got to study, it was very hard to study at home because of all the people that were there. So of course, for me, I'm actually lucky. When I was like in 4th grade, the McDonald's that was a block away got torn down and they turned it into a library. By the way, if they didn't do that, I'd probably be like, I don't know, 30 or 40 pounds heavier and maybe a little less knowledge in my brain. But I was very happy to know there was a library walking distance from my house, because anytime I had to get some serious studying done, I would just leave the house, go to the library. Now, that's not always feasible, but we want to limit distractions as much as possible. But there are other ways that you can improve your focus. And you want to think of your focus as a skill that can be improved. I know there are many people that will say, you know what, I have issues with attention. And there are serious issues related to ADHD. But I also want you to know that, your attention and your ability to focus is something that you can improve. So wherever you are, don't think that you're just stuck there. Now, one way you could improve your focus while reading is to use your hand as a guide. Now, if you've taken any one of our workshops in the past, you've probably heard us say this, that just plopping your hand on the page or your finger or even a pen is a great way to automatically improve focus. And that's because your eyes are naturally attracted to motion. Anything that moves around gets our attention. I know this is not practical when we're reading on the screen. Like if you're reading on your phone, you're not going to be going like this on your phone, or especially on the screen, you're not going to be dragging your finger on the screen. You could, I guess, if you don't mind touching your screen, or if it's not a touch screen. But there are other approaches for reading on the screen. But when you're reading on the printed page, like physical, actual book, this is the easiest way to immediately increase your focus. All right, so try that out next time you're reading on the page. But when we're reading on the screen, that's a different matter. So let's talk about reading on the screen. There is a useful tool that we created, and I'll put it in the chat. It's called hang on one second here. It's called Accelerator. And if you go to accelerator.com, let me do a little demo of it so you can see how it works. It's accelerator.com. And here's the thing. Basically, you just copy and paste your text in here. You click begin, and when you click read, the words are going to start blinking on the screen at whatever speed you set. Now, here's the thing. Because we're doing a YouTube live stream, the words are not going to blink at a consistent rate because we're streaming. So there's an upload process and then a download process. So the blinking is going to seem a little erratic when I show you how this works on the screen. But I promise you, when you do it on your own, it's going to be very consistent. But you take some sample reading material. In this case, this material is sourced from The Onion. Not sure if you're familiar with The Onion, but The Onion, if you're not familiar with it, is America's finest news source, as you can see right here. So we take some material right here, and we have this article, snowstorm in Chicago delays hundreds of morning murders. Yeah, so I'm from Chicago, so I get to talk trash about Chicago as much as I want. It's different if a New Yorker is talking trash about Chicago. Then I might get kind of up in arms, like, hey, what are you doing here? But anyway, we have this article about morning murders being delayed by a snowstorm. So we just copy the text, we paste it into the program, we click begin, and then when you click read, what you'll notice is the words start blinking on the screen. Let me show you exactly what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to stop it there because I can kind of tell that it's not a perfect stream of words because we're doing a YouTube live stream. But I'm looking on the side, it was going okay. Hopefully you were able to see that, but you get the idea. A few things you might notice about when we were doing this, you may have noticed it was blinking a couple words at a time. And most people, they read one word at a time. So in the settings here, you can change that under the chunk size. 2 words at a time. You can do it 3 words at a time, or 1 if you want. I recommend doing like 2, 3, or 4 to get started. And the words per minute, that's your speed over here. Enter whatever you want, whatever feels comfortable. By the way, the average reading speed's around 200 words a minute or so. So that's why I had it blinking at that particular speed. Actually, if I blinked it even faster, you would notice on the live stream, it will be tough to catch all the words because it's just going to blink. It's blinking a little faster now, but on the live stream, it might not pick it up. So let me pause that. But you get the idea. We could do this with other articles. Like over here, we have 4 copy editors killed in ongoing AP-style Chicago manual gang violence. So we do the same thing. We copy the text, we paste it into the program, and then we hit the begin button. And in the settings, you could modify and tweak a variety of other settings in here. And this is just to help you read and pace yourself when you're reading on the screen. So again, check out the Accelerator program when you have a chance. This is a useful reading tool if you want to train yourself to reading more efficiently on the screen. Now, what about when you're reading with diagrams? Like if you're reading something more technical, it's not as straightforward as a news article. You're going to have charts, tables, diagrams, things that look like this or like this. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up with their comprehension. So, you know, they'll read a paragraph, they look at this diagram and they're like, what in the world is going on here? Now I got to reread this section that talked about it. So here's another approach that you can take. The next moment it talks about, well, the first moment it says, refer to figure 2.2. Stop reading at that moment and look at 2.2 for like a first impression. Now I know that sounds obvious, but most people don't do that. Most people are like, it says refer to figure 2.2, and they're like, yeah. Figure 2.2 shows this, and it also shows this, and if you look over here, you'll notice this, and it starts overwhelming you with information. You get to the end of the paragraph, you finally look at 2.2, and they just gave you maybe 5, 6, 7 factoids about this diagram. You're not going to remember all that. And now you don't know where to start as to where you might look. I mean, this is not overly complex, but sometimes you have a figure diagram or table that is very complex. So what I suggest instead is more of a choppy way to read the material. So by choppy, I mean this. You read a sentence, like refer to figure 2.2, stop reading, visually check if you can verify that. And then you read the next sentence. Figure 2.2 shows this and this. Okay, let me check if I can actually visualize and see that. And it might also say, additionally, figure 2.2 shows the relationship between blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. Let me stop reading and check if I can visually verify that. Now, we've all heard that phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Think about your comprehension. When you read a little factoid of information, you get a little bit of comprehension. But when you see that happening in the graph or the table or the figure, that elevates your comprehension even further, right? Picture is worth 1,000 words. We understand it better. And then we go back and we read the next sentence. So it's kind of like this. You read a sentence, visually verify through the diagram. Read another sentence, visually verify. Read, verify. So, or as they say sometimes, trust but verify, right? We're just doing a different way of that, right? Read and verify, and that will help your comprehension. And you stop doing that when they stop referring to that particular figure or diagram. So just wanted to throw that in there because a lot of students that we work with will be dealing with very, very complex information, and they want to know how to read more efficiently. So this is how we might approach diagrams. Now, one other thing, we've been talking about improving focus because sometimes our mind just wanders off. Here's the thing. How long can you maintain your focus? Let me know in the chat, like if you had to read for a very long period of time, or you have to work on something that's very tedious, at what point do you say, oh, I'm done with this, I need to like get up out of my chair, go for a walk? Or at what point do you hit a wall? How many minutes does it take? Or I'd be surprised if you said like hours. If you're like, I like 4 hours. I mean, it's hard to maintain a high level of focus for 4 hours straight. At what point would your focus just fall off a cliff? There's actually some research into this. There's something called the, well, it has to do with alternating between 25 minutes and 5 minutes of a break. This is actually based on some research, and it's sometimes called the Pomodoro technique in the productivity world. But the idea is that you read or you do something, you focus for 25 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break. Now, that's not to say that you should follow this to the T, because everybody's different. I see some of you in the chat are telling me, I see Madison says 30 minutes, I see 20 minutes, I see Mark says 40 minutes, 25 minutes from Maggie, 30, 20, 25, okay, 15 to 20. Some of you might be like 9, right? If you feel like you have issues with, Tom brings up a good point, by the way, depends on the material, 5 to 60 minutes. That is true too, right? So just think of this as general guidance. If you gotta read for a very long period of time. I see Mr. Eric Martin is a big fan of the Pomodoro technique. I am too. So I got a little timer always on my desk over here. You could also just use your phone, but the idea is you use this Pomodoro technique. And here's why it's called the Pomodoro technique for those of you not familiar. Why is it called this? It was coined by this Italian student a number of years ago. He had a kitchen timer that was shaped like a tomato, and the Italian word for tomato is pomodoro. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but the idea is he found that he could study more effectively when he was setting his timer for 25 minutes and then taking a 5-minute break and just repeating that process through the day. So this is part of the reason why you want to do this. The main idea here is really the break, I'd say. So whether or not you choose 25 minutes or 15 minutes or having a small break, mental break, helps just like it would physically, right? You know, when you play a sport or if you exercise, right, you're going to take breaks every so often just to give your muscles a little breather, right? So we want to do the same thing when it comes to reading. I see Rohan says, I find it hard to stick to just 5 minutes for the break. That's a good point. You don't want to do the opposite of this, right? That's not very productive. 5 minutes of focus, 25 minutes of break. That might be not the most productive way to go about it. But having a timer helps. And there's a bunch of these Pomodoro timers out there. I mean, you don't have to get a fancy timer. You could just use your phone. But if you want something that kind of automates the process, I would recommend, especially if you're doing a lot of work and reading on your computer screen. I like using, I use Google Chrome. So I use this Pomodoro timer called Nucleus. And I'll show you what that looks like real quick here. By the way, if you are not using Chrome, there's probably one for Firefox add-on, or just use your phone or an app on your phone. I know iPhone and Android phones, if you just type Pomodoro timer, you'll find a bunch. Now, let me show you how this one looks. If you go to that link, and let me actually add that to the chat. The link, I made it irisreading.com/Pomodoro timer, but that just forwards to a longer link, irisreading.com/Pomodoro timer. Okay, there it is in the chat. It'll take you here. You click add to Chrome, and then we say, okay, add this extension. And now it's gonna pop up over here. You see that green button? Now, it disappears because on Chrome, they do this weird thing. You download an extension and then they hide it in this little area. So you click here, look for it, there it is, pin it to the menu. So pinning it is going to bring it up here, there it is. Now, what I like about this timer is when you actually click on it, it is not going to force you into 25 minutes. You can change the time to whatever you want. So I see some of you in the chat were saying, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, put whatever time in here you want, put whatever break time that you want, and then you just start the timer and it goes. Once the time is up, you get a little ding, and then it'll automatically start the 5-minute break, or you can reset these things. Now, the other cool thing about this timer, even when you're hiding it and you start doing whatever work or reading you're doing, it's still ticking away here, as you can see. But the other cool part is there is a website blocker. Now, this is for like personal accountability. You might be like, okay, I'm going to be reading here and I want to make sure I don't go to YouTube. By the way, I'm not going to enable this for YouTube because we're doing a live stream right now. And if it shuts off my YouTube access, that could actually end the stream. So let's say I'm like, okay, don't let me go to Reddit, add whatever websites you want here. Once you've got this enabled, do I have this enabled? Let's see here. If I go to reddit.com, it will block me. I like how it says, you should be focusing. Yeah, I hate being productive too. You try to go there again, it says, I'm judging you. Try to go there again, you deserve this. I mean, it'll give you a whole mess of things to kind of give you a guilt trip. I like this one in particular. Remember when you were working on that thing just now? Oh yeah, I was doing a webinar. Let me get back to the webinar. Anyway, you guys get the idea. Of course, you could remove this from Chrome, and there's ways to get around the blocker, obviously, but it's more so for personal accountability. So, so actually Cheryl says, I just got distracted when I went to the App Store to check if there's a Pomodoro app. So yeah, we get distracted easily by so many things. So here's another way to improve your focus. It's called the read and recall method. So here's the idea. Normally when we're reading, whether it's on the page or on the screen, sometimes our mind wanders off, but you don't know the moment your mind wanders off. If you did, you would stop yourself, right? You'd be like, hey, pay attention. Now, so you start reading, and actually reading researchers have a name for this. They call it mindless reading. Mindless reading is when you're just reading and you're progressing through line by line, page by page, but nothing is sinking in. And eventually you catch yourself like, hold on a second. I didn't understand any of the last few pages, or I don't even know how far back I need to go. Did I lose my focus 30 seconds ago? Or did I lose my focus, 3 minutes ago? So the next question is, now I got to figure out how far back do I go? So this just eats up precious time. So what we do instead, if you have this trouble where your mind is constantly wandering off, you utilize this read and recall method. And that just means you read for a predetermined amount of time and immediately try to recall what you just read. So for example, you might determine after I finish every section, I'm going to take notes. So that's going to be my way of recalling the information. By the way, the other way to recall could be just like you finish a section and you mentally just reflect on what did I just read for a second or two. Or you might take a quick note for a second or two. Now, we continue reading, and every section that we finish, we're going to force ourselves to take a note. So I see Rohan is mentioning, is that like the Feynman technique? I'll get into that. Actually, I have some slides on that in a few moments. Similar, not exactly the same. But the whole idea behind doing this is that when we finish a section of text, we're kind of keeping ourselves accountable. We write something down. Even if something is not very notable, just write down something. Now, here's where it comes in handy. Eventually, you will zone out, right? Especially if you've got attention issues. So let's say we take our notes here, we start reading, all of a sudden, there goes our focus, and I'm thinking about, man, I hope that flight that I have going to New York tomorrow, it better not be late. I hope it doesn't get canceled. I wonder what the weather's gonna be tomorrow. And all of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute, stop thinking about New York. You gotta go back. And where am I gonna go back to? I just go back here, right? Because the last time I took notes was right over here. So I know if I wander off at any point during the section, it's very easy for me to just go up, go back to here, start all over. So this is how we might keep our focus while we're reading. And also just the action of taking notes makes you focus a little more. Because when you get to the end of the section, you're asking yourself, what in the world did I just read? And that's a good way to keep your mind accountable. So let's talk a little bit about note taking here. How you take notes does kind of matter. I mean, when I see notes like this, I don't really know what to make of it. I see there are 2 columns, but of course, the person that took these notes, it'll probably make more sense to them. But how you take notes does matter. We've all taken outlines and notes like this, or underlining, or notes in the margin. But these are very linear ways of taking notes. Non-linear ways of taking notes, like mind mapping, might be more effective in certain situations. So I'm bringing up mind mapping. Some of you may have heard of mind maps, but I just want to bring it up as another way to kind of map out and get an assessment of our understanding, right? When we read something, and this is a mind map on how to create a mind map, but the idea is that your topic would go in the middle, and of course your sections go all over the place here. It's very non-linear. Now, if you did need order, like step 1, step 2, step 3, or some chronological order, this would kind of be like at the top, this would be section 1, this would be section 2, and you would go clockwise if you wanted to utilize some order. But not everything needs to have a precise order. Like if you talk about the topic of law, the general topic of law, well, what should be number 1? I mean, it could be anything. We could talk about contract law. We could talk about criminal law. We could talk about constitutional law. Same thing for other topics like physics. We could talk about Isaac Newton and his laws of motion, or we could talk about Einstein and his theories of relativity. We could talk about quantum mechanics, string theory. There's all sorts of things related to physics. Same thing with marketing, right? Marketing in the world of business would be, okay, are we talking about referral marketing? Are we talking about online marketing? And that's a whole beast in and to itself. With online marketing, there's SEO, there's pay-per-click advertising. So we can go on and on and on, but these things are not necessarily in an outline, linear format. So a lot of topics lend themselves to mind maps, and there's a reason why they call them mind maps. It's because it reflects the way that your mind works. We make associations to knowledge that we already know. So that's how we learn, basically. Now, there are tools that you can use, and I'll put some of these tools in the chat here. So one that I really like using for mind maps is Xmind. I like it because there's a free version. It works on a Mac, it works on a PC, so I like recommending this one. There are dozens of mind mapping programs out there, so I don't want to say that this is the absolute best one, because I'm sure there are new mind mapping programs coming out every year, but this is one of the better ones for sure from the ones I've experimented with, and it has a free version that's got a lot of features. Actually, you know what, let me share with you and show you. Here's an example of Xmind and the mind maps you can create with it. So as you can see, you've got just a central topic in the middle. So I don't know, this might be chapter 5 in your book. And then you got your main topic. You can type over that, add your details. And I'm just hitting the tab key to add details. Sometimes your details of details have their own details and so on. But you get the idea. You can add links here, format it however you want. I like to use mind maps for brainstorming. So when you are going to brainstorm, let's say, I'll give you an example. Brainstorming comes in handy when you're working on a presentation topic, or anytime I'm doing any kind of writing. And by the way, if you go to our blog, you can see some of the articles that we've written on various topics related to literacy and productivity. But I always start off with a brainstorm. I want to know, okay, I kind of know what I want to talk about, but I don't have it like in order yet. It's just jumbled up in my brain. So we start off, let's take all that information and try to dump it out of our brain. And I know I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about this. And I'm just double clicking to add topics that are just floating around, no particular order, just do a brainstorm. Any big or little topic goes wherever it goes. Once you're done with your brainstorm and you've dumped everything out of your brain, now we still might need to do research because I might not have all the information I want to talk about, but I'll start organizing this into more detail or a more organized fashion. So I'll say maybe this goes over here. This is going to be the first thing I talk about. This might be the second thing I talk about. Oh, this right here is related to that. This is related to this. Then I'm going to talk about this and this. So you can see I'm just taking, clicking, dragging, and we go from something that looked very messy initially to something that is a little more organized as we go on. So XMind, great tool for quickly creating mind maps. There's a lot of other features here. I'm not going to do a deep dive into this. One other mind mapping program, if you're looking for something that's not downloadable, but if you like keeping things in the cloud, which I'm a big user of programs like Evernote, Google Docs, things like that, keeping things in the cloud. But sometimes you want to be able to operate offline. Like when I get on flights, the Wi-Fi on airplanes is notoriously bad. So that's where I find programs like XMind where I need to have something offline so I can work with it. But if you want something that's, online, there's another program that I'd highly recommend called MindMeister. And again, let me put this in the chat here just so everybody has access to it. Mindmeister.com, would highly recommend that. And by the way, these are not tools that I'm getting paid to tell you about. These are tools that I just personally use that I find helpful. So just wanted to be upfront and transparent about that. MindMeister is web-based. It's got a different kind of a format and feel to it. But both of these programs, here's another cool thing about both of them. If you go to XMind or even MindMeister, they have an area of their website, like right here, you see mind maps. You can view shared mind maps here. So there's a bunch. You could just search for whatever you're searching for. Let's say you're a student and you're studying Hamlet. Okay, you can search for Hamlet and it'll show you a bunch of different mind maps that you can utilize. Same thing with MindMeister. If I get over there, do these programs work on the iPad? I believe they both have apps on the iPad, but you have to double check me on that because every so often, programs, iOS gets an update, for example, and sometimes apps no longer work with the latest version. So double check. I think they do work on the iPad. I don't like using mind maps on my phone because the screen is too small, but I would certainly use it on a tablet or on the desktop. So here is where you could find shared mind maps on a let's see here. Oh, and as you can see, if you add a mind map over here, it'll ask you, do you want a template? There's a whole bunch of templates that you can utilize here. So maybe you're doing a product launch. Maybe you've got a project that you're organizing. There's a bunch related to note-taking as well here with regard to education. So you can check that out, and there's a lot of very useful tools that you can find through through the MindMeister or XMind tool. All right, Feynman's note. Somebody had mentioned this in the chat, so I want to break this down for those of you. The read and recall method is similar to this, but I just want to go into more detail on Feynman. He's a very famous physicist, well-known, great science educator. One of the best. And he had a note-taking method that he would recommend to his students. It's kind of come to be known as Feynman's notes or Feynman technique, however you want to call it. But the idea is that, okay, you write your subject at the top first, and then you got to explain it in your own words. Not just copying. This is much more effective for comprehension because it's easy to highlight or underline something, or it's easy to just write something down word for word from the book or from the text. But it's a different thing when you have to explain it in your own words. That takes more mental effort, a little more mental effort, but it's better for your comprehension. Then you're going to review your content to see if you made mistakes. So that is the equivalent of, I read something, now I'm going to write some stuff down in my own words, explain it, and then I got to check, did I explain this the right way? Because I might read it and explain it the wrong way or miss key pieces of information. Step 4 is if you wrote down anything that was a technical term, you got to go back and rewrite it more simply. So it's kind of like you write it down in your own words and then simplify it. You want to think of this like, what if I had to explain this to a young child? How would I explain it? And that's where you know you have decent comprehension, or it improves your comprehension when you could actually explain something. Or in the teaching world, they'll sometimes say teach once, learn twice. That's because whenever you try to teach something to someone else, it improves your comprehension and your understanding of that material, and you're breaking it down for them. Now, again, think of it like if you had to explain it to a 5-year-old. Speaking of that, there is a great Reddit community called Explain Like I'm 5. And I love checking this out. It's a very, very popular community on Reddit. I'm going to put the link in the chat here. Explain Like I'm 5. I think that's the link. Bear with me here for a second. I'm just checking here. All right, that is the link. Okay, I'll submit it in the chat. If you go to this link, you'll find all sorts of posts on there that are not only interesting, but you might find them useful to further your comprehension in a topic. Okay, because here's what happens. Somebody asks a question, and then if you're not familiar with Reddit, the post or the comment at the top is usually the most upvoted topic or comment. So you'll have people that will explain it very, very well. And I see in the chat, Rohan mentions there are YouTube videos from Wired about explaining the same topics to people of different ages, education levels. So yeah, I used to have a subscription years ago to the magazine Wired. But yeah, check out the Wired YouTube channel for that. Now, or just YouTube in general, right? You can go and try to find a quick little video. I like to go on here because this community is so large, you'll find explanations for practically everything. Now, in here that you see on the screen, you see it says ELI 5, explain like I'm 5. Why does the human mind ignore the second the? Did you notice that? Did you miss it? First time I read this, I definitely missed it. You see it right there? There were 2 thes there. How did we miss that? Why does the human mind ignore the second the? Well, somebody's got an explanation for it right here. It says, in addition to what others have said, the human brain, when reading, doesn't actually, hang on here, let me back up so you can zoom in and see this. In addition to what others have said, the human brain, when reading, doesn't actually see every word unless you're not fluent in a particular language. Your eyes actually take in multiple words at a time and parse the sentence based on the words you've taken in. This also means that unless a particular particle is deadly important to the sentence, your brain ignores it. It also partially explains why sometimes you go back over a sentence if it doesn't parse correctly. An extra the doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, so you continue as if you understood. So that's a pretty good explanation for why that happens. Let me go to the actual Reddit community. Explain like I'm 5. I mean, you could just Google this as well, and it'll be the first link that pops up. But what I'm suggesting is if you're ever reading something and you're having trouble understanding it, I don't know, maybe you're studying Einstein's theories of relativity, or you want to know about special relativity. We can look here, like how does special relativity work? And somebody's going to have a post here that's got a bunch of upvotes or a bunch of comments, and you'll be able to see some information as to what's a good explanation as to what I was looking for. I see a question, where are you posting the links? I am posting these links in the chat here. Let's see here. Can you guys see my links when I post it over here? Let's see. Did you guys see the XMind link? Oh, I'm not seeing links either. Hold on 1 second. Let me get in here. I'm going to switch. On my other computer, I was posting as my name, my personal name in there. On the other computer, I'm going to log in under the Iris one, and I'm going to post them there. So my apologies for that. So XMind, mindmeister.com. What else? So you said explain like I'm 5. So reddit.com/. Thank you guys for telling me about that the links were not coming through. /r/explain like I'm 5. What else did we cover? We covered accelerator.com. Okay, so now they're posting. My apologies. For some reason, when I was posting from my personal profile, nothing was popping up in there. It showed me that I posted it, but I guess it was private to me and public to you. We'll get that hammered out in the next live stream. Now you got your notes, right? when should you actually review your notes? Because the whole point of writing something down is to review it later on, usually. But sometimes you write things down and you never look at it again. I was moving about a year and a half ago. That's when I moved to Miami area, and I was going through a bunch of storage, and I found a bunch of high school notebooks. And I remember looking through the notes, and I'm like, I don't even know I wrote these things down. Most of these notes I never even looked at again. So the question is, if you write something down and never look at it again, is it a waste of time? The answer is no. Just the action of writing something down, if you write it down and throw it away, it's still beneficial to your brain. Now, if I write it down and review it, that benefits me further. But when should I review my notes? If I'm a student and I got to know something inside out, when is a good time to write something down, review again? So this comes down to the question of how fast do we forget information? Because when you learn something, nobody has a perfect memory on the first capture or first exposure of the information. We remember things through repetition. So here's something called the forgetting curve. And this has to do with this question, how fast do we forget? Initially, very fast. As you can see, the forgetting curve, when you first learn something, you forget very quickly. So we have time on the x-axis, and we have retention on the y-axis. So it starts off, and we assume maybe, hopefully, we're initially at 100% comprehension or close to it. We got some new information, got it. And then we start forgetting. You ever forget someone's name almost immediately? You may have forgotten my name. I said it at the beginning, but my name's Paul Nowak. But if you forgot it, I'm not going to take it personally. People forget names all the time, but we forget quickly, right? And then when you hear someone's name again, hi, I'm Paul, it's temporarily at the top of your mind, but we still start to forget because that's just how our mind works. But we forget more slowly. And you review again, hi, I'm Paul. The more times you hear Paul Nowak, you'll eventually remember. Or the same thing goes with, you read something, you look at your notes, you review again. Eventually, repetition is how we remember things. I'll repeat that. Repetition is how we remember things. But we got to remember this forgetting curve and the fact that when you review something initially you got to review fast. And then you could space out the reviews later and later. You can space them further and further apart. So this kind of reminds me of a mathematical sequence. So I want to talk about a mathematical approach to memory and comprehension. Like, when should we review? We could look at this Fibonacci sequence, which looks like this. And I know some of you are familiar with the Fibonacci sequence. If you're not, here's how the sequence works. Basically, to get every additional number in the sequence, because this goes on forever, but to get the next number, you basically have to add the previous two numbers. So as you can see here, 1 plus 1, that's 2. 1 plus 2, 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. 5 plus 8 is now 13. 8 plus 13 is 21, and so on and so forth. But what I want you to look at here is that the spacing between these numbers, initially it's very small, but very quickly it starts to expand wider and wider and exponentially wider. This is going to mimic what we should actually be doing when we're reviewing our notes. Initially, the repetitions or the reviews have to happen very fast, but then you could space them out wider and wider and even wider. So you could kind of model this and add it into your just into your time management or into your day. Here's what I mean by this. Let's say you got to know something inside out. You got a test coming up tomorrow, or you got a big presentation and you read something, you got your notes, and I need to know this inside out. We're going to use this Fibonacci sequence. Here's what we do. We plot out the Fibonacci numbers, okay? You see them at the top? 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. On the bottom, let's just make an assumption. It's, I don't know, Saturday or Sunday, and it's when we're going to review. We just finished reading something at noon. Okay, when should I review my notes? I'm going to review an hour later. You see the next number in the Fibonacci sequence is 1. I'm going to review an hour later at 1 p.m. I'll set my alarms just to make sure on my phone I review my notes. And the notes might be quick. I might spend a minute reviewing my notes. It could be 5 minutes. I don't know. It could be longer if you were reading something very, very detailed. But then when should I review again? because I reviewed my notes just once. Now I'm going to review 2 hours later at 3 p.m. Now 3 hours later at 6 p.m. 5 hours later at 11 p.m. Now, thank goodness we started at 12 noon because that just conveniently happens to lead to 11 p.m. It's time to go to bed. You know, if you can get 8 hours of sleep, they say that's pretty good. It's about a third of your life, but they say that's pretty good. So now, first thing in the morning, 7 a.m., I'm going to review my notes again because maybe I got a test coming up in the morning, or maybe the test is tomorrow. When should I review my notes? 13 hours later at 8 p.m. Notice how now it's very, very wide, right? That review period. But notice initially it's very, very short. So that's the idea behind this Fibonacci sequence. And I'm not saying that you should do this to the T. By that I mean, you're not saying you should do this precisely at exactly 12 noon, 1 p.m. and so on. Because if these numbers were any different, you know, it would suggest that you should wake up at some point in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. and review your notes. Not saying you should do that. But the idea is that get your repetitions in quickly at first and then space them out wider and wider. It's not a bad idea to review something before you go to bed and first thing in the morning. Actually, reviewing something or thinking about something or watching movies or whatever it is, whatever's on your mind sometimes before you go to bed can sometimes lead to having dreams about it. So I don't know, would that be studying while you're sleeping? I was browsing Reddit last night and looking, I found this really interesting subreddit called combat footage and all sorts of very disturbing videos related to combat footage. Many of them with regard to what's going on in the Ukraine right now. And I had a dream about a war. And it was probably influenced by the fact that I was doom scrolling through this news subreddit, which was interesting and also very disturbing. But how do we use this? I'm not a student, but if I was a student, I'm not going to doom scroll through something like that. I'm going to review my notes before I go to bed, because also the sleeping process helps with your memory. So if you can get good sleep, that will benefit your memory too. I'd rather be thinking about something school related before going to bed. And of course, sometimes I'm reading, sometimes I'm doom scrolling before I go to bed, but whatever you're doing, it can influence what you're going to be thinking about in the middle of the night or dreaming about. And with regard to learning, it's a good idea to review those notes before you go to bed. So how long do we do this? Until you get confident enough. How many repetitions we got here? You finish reading at 12, you got notes, right? That's your first exposure to like your chapter. But then an hour later, that's another repetition, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, more repetition. And we just keep this process going so we can intensify the review periods, but over a wide spaced, they call this spaced repetition, by the way. We're basically interrupting the forgetting curve. Look, I got my information at noon. Oh, starting to forget. That's okay. 1 hour later, I'm going to remind myself. It's now top of mind. But I still will forget. 2 hours later, back to being top of mind. Now I'm forgetting more slowly. Eventually, this line is not going to be dropping. After a certain amount of repetitions, it's going to be flat. That's where your comprehension and your long-term, it basically is the process of turning short-term memory into long-term memory. And that's on an hourly basis. You don't have to do it hourly. Like for me, I'm not a student, so I probably wouldn't do this to the extreme. I do this to the extreme when I have like a presentation I'm preparing for, and I really need to know it inside out, and it's maybe the first time I'm giving that presentation, I'll do something like this. But what if I'm just casually reading a book? What I like to do is I'll do a daily frequency. When I say daily, I mean using the Fibonacci numbers to review 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, 5 days later. Actually, when I'm reading just casual information, I'll use a monthly frequency. So I'll get through a book and I'll have maybe a mind map on what that whole book was about, and I'll set on my calendar 1 month later to review those notes. 2 months later, 3 months later, 5 months later. So that's another way to do it. You don't do this, you know, for an infinite amount of times, but maybe you do it for 7 repetitions or 10 repetitions, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Now, as far as improving comprehension goes, there's another thing that you can do, and that is to change up your reading speed. You shouldn't always be going at the exact same rate. So here's an article, and I have this article in the the link that is on the bottom of this video. Again, that's irisreading.com/comp, in case you're wondering where that is referenced. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. This time the chat is hopefully working. Let me know if you guys can see that in the chat, irisreading.com/comp. Here's where you can find this article, but it's basically just a one-page article, India's skills famine. If you were going to read and understand this well, most people read the same speed throughout the entire document. What you should do is be changing your speed. Sometimes slower, sometimes faster. Good rule of thumb to follow: slow down on the first sentence of a paragraph and then speed up a little bit. Slow down, speed up, slow down, speed up. Why? You already know the first sentence is usually the main idea, or the topic sentence, introduction, however you want to call it. Let me zoom in on this so you can see. So from this article, India's skills famine, the first paragraph here reads, "The economic transformation of India is one of the great business stories of our time." Sounds like a main idea to me. I'm going to take that, I'm going to run with this. Now I get to the end of the paragraph, I'm going to apply the brakes, slow it down a little bit. But India has run into a surprising hitch on its way to superpower status. Its inexhaustible supply of workers is becoming exhausted. Another main point, let me speed up now. How is this possible in a country that every year produces 2.5 million college graduates and 400,000 engineers? Interesting, now I speed up. There was a time when many economists believed that post-secondary education didn't have much impact on economic growth. You see how all these first sentences are giving us a ton of information? So we slow down here, speed up here. Slow down, speed up. When I say slow down, I don't mean extremely slow. I just mean a little bit slower. And when I say speed up, I don't mean extremely fast. So here's another first sentence. The irony of the current situation is that India was once considered to be overeducated. Interesting. Now we speed up. Since the Second World War, the countries that have made successful leaps from developing to developed status have all poured money, public and private, into education. And then we speed up again. Here's the last paragraph. India has taken tentative steps to remedy its skills famine. The current government has made noises about doubling spending on education, and a host of new colleges and universities have sprung up since the mid-1990s. Okay, we get the idea. First sentences are usually main ideas. Changing up your speed is going to force you to pay attention, and here's why. Oh, I see a question in the chat here. When you speed up, do you still read all the words? Yes, you're still reading all the words. You're just going a little faster. It's like if I blinked a word on the screen real quick, you might recognize that word. I could blink them at a speed that is fast enough to where you might not say all the words in your head, but you recognize the words. But here's the thing about changing your speed. You ever have a professor that spoke in a monotone voice like this? Imagine if we did the workshop today and I'm like, "Hello everyone, my name is Paul Nowak, and today we're going to be talking about comprehension strategies to improve your understanding." If I talk like that, people will go nuts, or they'll just tune me out, because that's not how normal people talk. I mean, sometimes you get a professor that speaks in a monotone voice for some reason. Robots. So it's hard to pay attention to someone that speaks that way, because the volume of the voice is staying constant. The speed of the voice is staying constant. That's why we lose attention. What happens when you read at a constant speed? Your brain is going to tune out. So it's good to change it up. Slow it down, speed it up. Slow it down, speed it up. So that's going to help your comprehension. Now, one other thing I want you to note. I just read the first sentence of each paragraph here, and you kind of know what it's going to be about, right? Just by me doing that. So what is going to happen when you read this entire article? I'll bet you'll read it a bit faster, right? You'll have better comprehension too. So the idea here now is, and this is extremely important, probably one of the most important things with regard to comprehension. If you want better comprehension, you need to inspect before you read. When I say inspect, that means get familiar with something before you read it. That sounds very obvious, but most people don't do this. Most people are like, okay, page 1 of chapter 1, let's do this. And slowly but surely, they'll get to the end, and then they get to the end and they're like, how come I can't remember, or I didn't understand this that well? What if instead you jumped around and you read the first sentence of each paragraph first, get all your main ideas? Or if you're reading something like a chapter, a report, or a journal article, you might read your introduction first, and then your questions, maybe your headings and subheadings. You're looking at maybe the words that are in bold, italics. You're reading tables, charts, diagrams. You're looking at them. If you're reading history, you might have some pictures along the way, historical documents, things like that. But I would just read the titles of those charts, tables, or diagrams. I get to the end of the chapter, I'm reading my conclusion. Maybe there's some questions at the end. This is step number one when you're reading just about anything. Okay, I understand maybe nonfiction, because fiction is not structured like this. You might not want to know the ending because you don't want to spoil it. But when you're reading nonfiction, always a good idea to jump around, get familiar with something before you read it. What do you do before you play a sport? Before you exercise? You warm up, right? You stretch out. Exactly. So I see some funny things in the chat. Bueller. Okay, now let's try it out. We're going to do this is going to be our final exercise for the session. Go to irisreading.com/comp. Get this file right here, flow.pdf, and we are going to read this, but we're going to start with a little inspection. So you see the way this article is structured, going with the flow, we've got a little quote at the beginning. The parts that I highlighted are what I would have you read before you actually read this in its entirety. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read this, but I want you to read this first. This part, right? We'll read it together. Okay, going with the flow. Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like. Okay, this is a quote from Lao Tzu, and we have this first heading right here. Realize that you can't control everything. Become aware. Breathe. Get perspective. Practice. Laugh. Realize that you can't control others. Now, I would also read this last part here. As you can see, the passage is selected from the book Focus, a Simplicity Manifesto in the Age of Distraction. This is by the same author as the previous article that you had. It's extracted from the same book. Now, you have some background knowledge, and this is key when it comes to comprehension. Now you're going to read this, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Now, you don't have to read that intro again, but the fact that we spent like less than 30 seconds, probably less than 20 seconds reading all those highlights, that little investment of time is going to be a nice investment for improving our comprehension. So I want you to now read this material, and we're going to see how does that impact your comprehension. We're going to assess your comprehension afterwards, but you're going to read, I'll give you 2 minutes maximum. Why? Because we got to end the live stream in a little bit. I was shooting for an hour. It looks like we're going a little bit over on the hour. Apologies for that. But we got 2 minutes. I want you to read through this article. Some of you might finish the article in 2 minutes or less, but get through as much of it as you can. I will disable my webcam during the 2 minutes. You'll see how much time is left at the top. It'll be ticking away. So go ahead and begin reading this. All right, let me stop it there. And I'm curious to know if your comprehension was a little better this time around. There's a little poll I just popped up in the chat there, and you can just enter. Was your comprehension a little better this time around? We read for 2 minutes on both articles, the one at the beginning, the one at the end. And if you found your comprehension a little better, it's not surprising, right? And that is precisely what we're trying to hammer home with this strategy of, before I read something, I should get familiar with it. It's so funny because it is very obvious advice, but most people don't do it. In my experience, about 95% of students and professionals will not look ahead. When they're reading nonfiction material, they'll just, they might read the back, they'll read, the table of contents, but then when they get to chapter 1 or the introduction, they'll just read in a linear way. Now, it's better when you get familiar, because then you're setting yourself up for better comprehension. So if you made an improvement, that's why we got the success baby there. This kid's been an internet meme for a number of years. I wonder how old he is now. Anyway, so this is the idea. Inspect, let's just get the gist of it. I see Tom says, that's a really good article in my humble opinion. I think so too. Speaking of that, if you guys liked this article, let me jump over to the next, this slide right here, because if you liked this article, the author of this book has given us permission to freely distribute the PDF of his book. So it's a great read if you're interested in improving your focus. And this is more along the lines of like productivity. Leo Babauta is also he's also the author of the popular blog Zen Habits. Anyway, it's a quick read. It's about 100 pages. If you want me to shoot you a link to that PDF, shoot me an email. My email is just paul@irisreading.com, and I will make sure I send you the PDF of that book. Just let me know you're in the session today, and I'll send it over. But that's where you could find, that's where the other 2 articles from today's session were extracted from. Now, next thing I want to talk about with you is IRIS method. We're going to be wrapping up here, and here's where this leads. So IRIS is an acronym for, well, it's the name of our organization, but it is an acronym for an approach that you would take to reading something comprehensively. And that is, you start off by inspecting it, getting the gist of it, right? Inspect. How you inspect depends on the material. Next, we read the material. And when you read through the material, you're getting whatever comprehension you're getting. And then when you're done reading, there's something that most people don't do. Most people are done reading and they're like, okay, I'm done. Or they just go on to the next chapter. Stop for a moment to inquire about what you just read. When I say inquire, I mean ask questions. Questions help focus the mind. By the way, I do realize there is another British English version for inquire with an E, but we're not going to use that because then our acronym doesn't work, okay? But ask questions about what you just read. Questions like, what in the world did I just read? Questions that could be more specific, like, what are the biggest takeaways from this chapter that I read? Or questions like, what's going to be on the test? What do I got to memorize? That's going to lead us to the storage step. Now, we don't have enough time to cover memorization techniques. There's a bunch of them. You can check out one of our online courses for that, or take one of our courses in person. I'm actually doing one in person in New York this weekend. We have courses in a number of other cities that we're starting to roll out. We just started rolling these out. So feel free to join one in person or online. That's where you could find more information about that. But while we're going through this process, we're kind of upgrading our comprehension little by little. Like I said, if you want that book on focus, feel free to shoot me an email. And here's where you could find us for future content. You know what, we've been keeping people on the stream here pretty consistently the whole time. So I think we're going to do more of these live streams. If you have suggestions as to what we might cover in the future, shoot it in the chat box and we'll try to cover that information. And this is on the Iris Reading channel. If you want to follow me at my personal channel right over here, Paul Nowak. Also on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, we've got a great Facebook group for book lovers. It's called Book Lovers Assemble. And one of our head instructors, Cynthia, is very involved in that group. You should check that out at irisreading.com/booklovers. I'm going to put that in the chat here. That's where you could find that, along with the different other social media areas. But I want to thank you all so much for attending. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I hope you found today's session helpful. And if you did, tell your friends about us. If you didn't, you got to tell your enemies about us, because that's how it goes. That'll show them. But I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. Hope you found this helpful. Feel free to keep in touch with us here, and I will look forward to joining you guys next time. And actually, we'll plan on a live stream next week. So make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and that will keep you posted on when we're doing these. Thank you all so much for attending. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.